Staff Sergeant Nora Callahan had been humiliated in front of 200 passengers, escorted from first class like common baggage, forced back to economy, while Navy officers smirked and whispered about support staff who didn't belong with real rank. But when the engines started failing over the Atlantic, those same officers went silent. And when the SEAL pilot opened the cockpit door, he wasn't looking for them. He was looking for her. Before I show you what happened at 30,000 feet, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning fog at Heathrow rolled across the tarmac like cigarette smoke in a dive bar. Thick, gray, and reluctant to clear. Staff Sergeant Nora Callahan moved through Terminal 3 with quiet efficiency. Olive drab duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Posture straight but unassuming. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her jacket more functional than fashionable. Nothing about her screamed for attention. That was intentional. Her ticket said Economy Row 29A. She hadn't expected anything else, but when the gate agent scanned her boarding pass, the machine beeped twice and spat out a fresh slip. Complimentary upgrade, the agent said with a practiced smile. First class seat 3C. Nora blinked, genuinely surprised. Thank you, she said simply. First class smelled different, leather and something faintly citrus. She settled into 3C, tucked her duffel beneath the footrest, and pulled out her worn paperback about ancient Rome. That should have been the end of it. But across the aisle, two men had noticed her arrival. They weren't subtle about their assessment. Late 30s, broad shoulders, military haircuts grown out just enough to suggest they were on leave. She caught the glint of anchor tattoos, a Naval Academy class ring. Officers, definitely. Hell's she doing up here? One muttered not quietly enough. His companion snorted, ice clinking in his glass. Diversity hire probably. Some admin clerk who checked the right boxes figures they'd bump her up ahead of people who actually earned it. Nora turned a page without looking up. She'd heard this before in mess halls and motor pools, wherever men gathered to discuss who belonged and who didn't. But the first officer wasn't finished. He leaned toward a passing flight attendant. Excuse me. You sure about the seating arrangements? She doesn't exactly fit the profile for this section. First class is usually reserved for paying customers. People with actual rank. Nora felt eyes shift toward her from across the cabin. A businessman adjusted his tie and looked away. The flight attendant's smile faltered, caught between service protocols and the uniforms in front of her. She crouched beside Nora's seat, voice apologetic. Ma'am, I'm very sorry, but there seems to have been an error with your seating assignment. I need you to move back to your original seat. Nora closed her book without a sound, marking her place with a worn boarding pass. She met the attendant's eyes, finding no malice there, just uncomfortable duty, and nodded once. Of course. She stood and stepped into the aisle. The Navy officers watched her pass, satisfied smirks playing at their mouths. One stage whispered, some people can't tell the difference between support staff and actual leadership. The other chuckled into his drink. Give them a uniform and they think they belong anywhere. Whispers spread through the first class like ripples. Nora said nothing. She walked to row 29, where economy pressed passengers together like sardines. Her original seat was narrower, the overhead bins stuffed full. She wedged her duffel beneath the seat and settled back. Around her, fellow passengers avoided eye contact. They'd seen her escorted back, caught enough whispered conversation to piece together a familiar narrative. Nora folded her hands in her lap and fixed her gaze out the tiny window. Her face betrayed nothing, but something settled in her chest like a stone. She'd carried humiliation before, worn it like extra gear during years spent proving herself in spaces that hadn't been designed for her. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, that weight pressed down. The wrong lingered behind her like turbulence, invisible but impossible to ignore. The plane climbed through the cloud layers, engines settling into the steady thrum that would carry them across the Atlantic. From her window seat, Nora watched the English countryside shrink until it looked like a child's model railroad. Around her, the cabin had settled into long-haul rhythms. Attendants wheeled drink carts down aisles. Laptops opened toward reading lights. Conversations died to murmurs. The universal process of strangers learning to coexist in a metal tube for 8 hours. Nobody made eye contact with her. The passengers nearby had witnessed her walk of shame, heard enough commentary to construct their own version of events. In a cabin full of chatter, Nora Callahan had become effectively invisible. She didn't mind invisibility. For years, she'd worked in shadows beside cockpits instead of inside them. The mechanic nobody noticed until an engine screamed or hydraulics bled out. Still, humiliation sat in her chest like undigested food. She opened her book again, but her eyes kept drifting toward the front of the aircraft. During boarding, the captain had stood briefly in the galley doorway. Most people had nodded politely and moved on, but Nora's trained eye had caught details others missed. The wings on his uniform were silver regulation pilot's wings, but just above them, a small pin gleamed gold, a seal trident. She'd only seen a handful in her career, always on people whose reputations traveled farther than their names. From the front, laughter drifted back like smoke. The two Navy officers were well into their second round, voices carrying easily over the white noise. Problem with the modern military, one was saying, gesturing with his glass, is too many paper soldiers. Whole armies full of them now. Desk jobs, mechanics, support staff. None of them belong in the real fight. His companion nodded sagely. Bet that one back in economy couldn't even field strip a rifle. Probably calls roadside assistance when her car won't start. Scattered chuckles rippled through nearby seats. Nora stared at cloud formations building on the horizon. Her face unchanged. She'd learned that some conversations weren't worth joining, especially when the speakers had already decided what they knew about you. The plane hit turbulence. Nothing serious. Just enough to rattle ice and make passengers glance around nervously. Nora felt it differently. Not as random buffeting but as communication from the machine itself. The slight hesitation in the left engine's rhythm. The way the wing flexed to absorb stress. She'd spent too many years listening to aircraft to miss the signs when they started talking. And this one was beginning to whisper things that made her pay attention in ways the other passengers weren't. An hour into the flight, cruising altitude brought false calm. The seat belt sign had clicked off. Cabin lights dimmed for the long stretch over dark water. Passengers dozed with blankets. Screens flickered with movies. Attendants moved with practiced rhythm. Nora kept her eyes closed, but never really slept on flights. Old habit from too many military transports where sleep meant missing the warning rattle or pitch change that came before something failed. She listened with more than her ears. The first sign was smell, a faint acrid tang in the recirculated air buried beneath coffee and cleaning solutions. To most passengers, it was just airplane smell. To Nora, it was unmistakable. Overheated wiring, insulation cooking under electrical strain. Then came the sound, a barely perceptible cough in the left engine, masked by steady drone. But she'd spent years learning to hear individual voices in that chorus, and one was starting to stutter. She sat forward, gaze narrowing on the wing. The flex pattern looked normal. The exhaust trail wasn't. A subtle vibration rippled through the fuselage, not turbulence, but mechanical stress. Overhead, bins rattled softly. A baby started crying 3 rows back. Then the lights flickered, not once but twice. Long enough for people to look up from entertainment screens with unease. Long enough for Nora's hands to clench on her armrests. The intercom crackled, but before the captain could speak, thin gray smoke began seeping from ventilation grills above first class. Just wisps, but enough to carry that bitter electrical smell throughout the forward cabin. The change was immediate. Heads snapped toward the ceiling. Conversations died. Someone said, "Is that smoke?" in a voice pitched higher than normal. Flight attendants materialized with movements just too quick to be casual. "Please remain calm and seated," one announced, but her smile looked painted on. "We're investigating a minor technical issue." Nora's pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Combat training had drilled that response. When everyone else panicked, you slowed down, took inventory. She breathed carefully. Smoke from electronics definitely, but no raw fuel, no combustion smell, not an explosion, not fire in the cabin. But something electrical was cooking itself to death. A deep shudder ran through the airframe. hard enough to slosh drinks and rattle overhead compartments. One popped open above row 15, spilling a laptop bag before snapping shut. People gasped. Someone screamed and the baby's crying turned into wailing. In first class, the Navy officers were on their feet, earlier confidence evaporating. "What the hell's happening?" one demanded, grabbing a passing attendant. "Why haven't we turned around?" Their voices carried pure fear now, stripped of the authority they displayed when mocking passengers. Panic looked the same on everyone, regardless of rank. The intercom finally came alive with the captain's voice, calm, but carrying an undertone that made experienced travelers sit up straight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing technical difficulties and working through our checklist. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened while we resolve this situation." The message ended, leaving silence that felt heavier than the smoke. Whispers began spreading like infection. "Engine trouble. Electrical fire. We're going down." Nora sat perfectly still, cataloging everything her training had taught her to notice. The uneven tone in the left engine, now clearly audible. The subtle delay in the aircraft's response when it adjusted for air currents. The faint metallic groaning that spoke of systems working harder than designed. This wasn't routine turbulence or a minor technical glitch. This was cascading system failure. The kind emergency flight crews trained for but hoped never to face. She'd been here before in different aircraft, over different continents. In Afghanistan, watching a Chinook limp home on one screaming engine. Inside an Apache when a power surge fried half the avionics mid-mission. Both times, survival had come down to calm hands and fast decisions by people who understood that machines could be coaxed through failure if you knew how to listen. 10 minutes crawled by like hours. The electronic smell had spread despite ventilation working overtime. Passengers sat rigid. Every face turned toward the ceiling whenever lights flickered, which they did with increasing frequency. The left engine's tone continued its irregular rhythm. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with clipboards and forced smiles, conducting routine safety checks that Nora recognized as preparation for emergency procedures. Securing loose items, identifying passengers needing assistance, positioning emergency equipment. Then something happened that Nora had never seen on a commercial flight. The cockpit door opened. Captain Damian Rourke stepped into the cabin, and his presence changed the entire atmosphere. Not tall in a way that dominated space, but carrying himself with controlled authority that made narrow aisles seem to widen around him. Close-cropped gray hair, weathered face, uniform pressed despite the stress. His eyes swept the cabin, sharp, practiced, cataloging details most would miss. The Navy officers pounced like starving animals. Finally, one barked, lurching from his seat. "What the hell is happening? This whole flight's a disaster. Why haven't you turned us around? We demand answers." The other joined in. Captain Rourke didn't break stride. He looked at them with flat professional assessment that reduced grown men to children and dismissed them with a glance so final it cut off their protests. Then his gaze swept past them, scanning economy until it locked on exactly who he was looking for. Staff Sergeant Callahan. Nora's head snapped up. Hearing her rank and name in the captain's mouth was like being struck by lightning. Unexpected. Precise. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully. "Army aviation maintenance. Fixed and rotary wing platforms, combat and transport configurations." His voice wasn't asking for confirmation. It was verifying information he already possessed. Her throat went dry. "That's correct, sir." "How did you?" Passenger manifest lists more than names and seat assignments. His words were clipped. Urgent. "Right now, I have a situation developing that's not covered in any manual. And I need someone with hands-on experience looking at problems my instruments can't diagnose." The silence that fell over surrounding rows was absolute. Passengers who'd been whispering prayers suddenly found themselves listening to a conversation. One that sounded like setup for either salvation or disaster. The Navy officers shot up from their seats, indignation overriding panic. "Wait just a minute. She's not qualified for." Captain Rourke turned on them with movements sharp enough to cut glass. "Staff Sergeant Callahan has more hands-on turbine experience than my entire flight crew combined. She's troubleshot mechanical failures in combat conditions that would ground this aircraft permanently. You want to help save this flight? Sit down, shut up, and let me work with someone who knows the difference between theory and practice. The words hit first class like physical force. Mouths hung open, faces flushed red, but no sound came out. The men who'd spent the flight mocking her competence now found themselves dismissed by someone whose opinion actually mattered. Every eye in the surrounding rows fixed on Nora. She felt the weight of their attention. The sudden shift in perception as people reassessed everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman in seat 29A. Captain Rourke extended his hand toward her. Not ceremonial, just direct. Staff Sergeant, I need you in my cockpit now. Military training moved her body before conscious thought caught up. She unbuckled, rose from the cramped economy seat, and stepped into the aisle. Whispers followed her movement like a wake, some incredulous, some relieved, some ashamed of earlier assumptions. She walked past the Navy officers, both red-faced and staring at their shoes, neither able to meet her eyes. For the first time since boarding, they had nothing to say. Captain Rourke led her toward the front, past the curtain separating passengers from crew, toward the door that sealed the cockpit from the rest of the world. As it closed behind them, cabin murmurs faded, leaving only strained machinery and alarms waiting for someone who could understand what they were really saying. In that moment, Nora Callahan stopped being the humiliated passenger from row 29A. She became the only thing standing between 200 lives and the Atlantic Ocean 30,000 feet below. The cockpit was smaller than people imagined and louder than anyone expected. Warning lights painted instrument panels in reds and ambers that pulsed like angry heartbeats, while alarms competed for attention in frequencies designed to trigger immediate response. The air was thick with heat and tension, tinged with that bitter smell of electronics pushed beyond limits. Captain Rourke slid back into the left seat while his first officer, Lieutenant Ethan Maddox, remained hunched over, displays showing more problems than solutions. Hydraulic pressure fluctuating wildly. Engine temperature spiking. Autopilot system completely dark. The kind of cascading failure that turned routine flights into aviation disaster documentaries. Staff Sergeant Callahan, Rourke said, motioning to the cockpit observer seat. Strap in tight. Nora dropped into the small jump seat behind them and pulled the 4-point harness across her chest. The space was cramped, designed for emergency inspectors rather than comfort. But she'd spent years working in spaces even smaller. Rourke's voice cut through electronic chaos. We've lost multiple redundant systems simultaneously. Autopilot's dead. Left engine running rough. Hydraulics bleeding pressure faster than we can compensate. Every checklist we've run comes back negative. Systems that should work don't. Backups that should engage won't. Maddox turned briefly, sweat beading despite the air conditioning. Sir, with respect, she's a passenger. Protocol doesn't. Rourke snapped. Right now, I need someone who's lived inside these systems, not just trained on them. Nora leaned forward, eyes moving across the instrument array with the systematic approach she'd developed over years of troubleshooting under pressure. She ignored alarms and focused on patterns, relationships between failing systems, timing of warning cascades, mechanical symptoms computers couldn't interpret. Your portside temperature sensor is giving false readings, she said after 30 seconds of analysis. It's showing thermal stress that isn't there. If you throttle back based on that data, you'll starve the engine and lose it completely. Maddox blinked, glancing between instruments and her face. Rourke's hand moved immediately to the throttle controls, making minute adjustments that smoothed out the left engine's irregular rhythm. How can you tell? Rourke asked. Exhaust pattern visible through cabin windows doesn't match the temperature readout. Also, vibration frequency is wrong for thermal stress. It's electrical interference feeding false data. She pointed to a secondary display. Your backup sensor array is still functioning. Cross-reference the readings. Rourke followed her guidance, and immediately the engine stabilized. Not perfect, but no longer threatening to quit entirely. Outstanding. What else? Nora's training took over completely. Years of diagnosing mechanical problems where wrong answers got people killed had taught her to see aircraft as living systems rather than collections of parts. Hydraulic leak isn't where your system thinks it is, she continued, scanning pressure readings. You've got a cross-feed valve stuck partially open, bleeding pressure into the wrong circuit and confusing diagnostics. Manual override, reroute through auxiliary, and you can stabilize rudder control long enough to get us down. Maddox hesitated, looking to Rourke for confirmation. Rourke nodded immediately. Do it. The first officer's hands moved across controls, implementing her suggestions. Hydraulic pressure stabilized, rudder response smoothed out, and for the first time in 20 minutes, the aircraft felt under control rather than barely contained. Jesus, Maddox muttered. How did you? I've patched this exact failure configuration on a C-30 in combat conditions, Nora said simply. Your bird's more sophisticated, but fundamental systems are similar. Metal and physics work the same way whether you're over Afghanistan or the Atlantic. Rourke turned to look at her directly. Staff Sergeant, you're not leaving this cockpit until we're on the ground. Clear? Yes, sir. The next hour dissolved into a rhythm of crisis and correction. Nora identified a fuel flow imbalance the computer had missed, recalibrated a navigation sensor using manual inputs when electronics gave conflicting readings, and provided running commentary on mechanical stress patterns that kept them ahead of failures before they became catastrophic. But through it all, she could feel the aircraft struggling against problems bigger than any individual system failure. This was the kind of emergency aerospace engineers designed redundant systems to prevent multiple critical failures happening simultaneously, creating conditions no single procedure could address. The decision came fast and without debate. Rourke's voice was steel when he made the call. Keflavik Air Base. Iceland. Military installation. Longer runway. Crash equipment on standby. 90 minutes flying time with one engine running rough. Hydraulics patched by improvisation. And storm clouds building like mountain ranges across our path. Through the cockpit windows, lightning split the sky in jagged forks that painted instrument panels in brief electric blue. Nora kept her eyes moving between gauges and the weather outside, calling adjustments in steady streams. Throttle steady, don't chase the fluctuations. Feed auxiliary hydraulics now. 20% buffer before the cross-feed valve fails completely. Turbulence hit them like a physical assault, dropping the aircraft hard enough to slam everyone against restraints. In the cabin behind them, overhead bins rattled, drinks spilled, and the sounds of genuine terror rose above mechanical noise. Hold her level. Maddox shouted as the control yoke kicked against his hands. Rourke's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Easy. Don't fight the weather. Ride it. Callahan, talk to me. Nora felt the aircraft bucking beneath them, reading stress patterns and how the airframe responded to each gust. This was the same kind of flying she'd experienced in military transports over mountain ranges where weather could kill faster than enemy fire. She's fighting on the left side because the engine's not giving consistent power. Compensate 2 degrees right. Bleed pressure to crossfeed. Don't try to muscle through the turbulence. Let her flex, she's designed for this. Rourke followed her guidance, hands light on the controls, working with the aircraft instead of against it. The plane steadied slightly, still bucking, but no longer threatening to tear itself apart. Through the storm, they caught glimpses of the Icelandic coast, a rocky barren landscape swept by winds that could strip paint from metal. Runway lights at Keflavik appeared and disappeared behind curtains of rain, distant but growing larger. Gear down, Rourke ordered. The hydraulics groaned in protest. Warning lights flared across the panel like Christmas decorations designed by someone having nightmares. Nora's hand shot to manual override. Systems not responding normally. You'll have to drop on gravity, not hydraulic pressure. Manual extension. The landing gear clunked into position with sounds that suggested it was barely holding together. 3 green lights confirmed lockdown, but indicators showed pressure readings that made everyone in the cockpit hold their breath. Confirmed and locked, Maddox reported, voice tight. Outside the windows, the runway rushed toward them through sheets of rain that made visibility nearly zero. Approach lights strobed past the windscreen like tracers, marking their descent path toward solid ground that suddenly seemed very far away. This is going to be rough, Rourke called out. The words were barely out of his mouth when they hit the runway. Impact. The landing gear slammed into concrete with a sound like artillery fire. The aircraft bounced once, hard enough to lift everyone against their restraints before the wheels bit down and held. Smoke poured from the brakes as Rourke fought to keep them straight. Engines screaming in reverse thrust. The entire airframe shuddering with the violence of a controlled crash. The plane slowed gradually, fighting momentum and weather until finally grinding to a complete stop in the middle of the rain-soaked runway. For 10 seconds there was no sound except the tick of cooling metal and the drum of rain against aluminum skin. Then, as if released from a spell, the entire cabin erupted. In applause, sobbing, and laughter that sounded like hysteria but felt like rebirth. They were alive. All of them. Rourke reached over and shut down the engines. His movements deliberate and final. In the sudden quiet, he turned to look at Nora, rain streaking the windscreen behind him like tears. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying weight no regulation manual could define. "That landing goes in your logbook too." She held his gaze and nodded once. There was nothing else that needed saying. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft within minutes. But the crisis was over. What remained was aftermath. People realizing they were safe, the paperwork and investigations that would follow, the bureaucratic machinery that turned life and death decisions into official reports. The storm still hammered the runway outside, turning tarmac into a lake of reflected emergency lights. But inside, there was only the stunned quiet of people processing their own survival. When the cabin door finally opened, cold Icelandic air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain, aviation fuel, and the indefinable scent of safety. Nora emerged from the aircraft into the chaos of flashing lights and shouted instructions, rain soaking through her jacket within seconds. She stood for a moment beside the landing gear, looking up at the aircraft that had carried them all through impossible conditions. The Airbus looked smaller on the ground, scarred but intact. Rain washed stress marks from its aluminum skin. Battle damage, she thought. The kind of wear that marked machines and people, tested beyond design limits and surviving anyway. Staff Sergeant. She turned to find Rourke approaching through the rain, his uniform jacket dark with water, but posture still carrying command authority. Without hesitation, in full view of passengers still moving toward the terminal, emergency personnel conducting organized chaos, and ground crews working around the landing gear, Rourke came to attention and rendered a sharp, deliberate salute. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't protocol. It was recognition, from one professional to another. Acknowledgement of competence demonstrated under pressure. Competence that had saved lives when everything else failed. The gesture cut through noise and confusion like a signal flare. Ground crew members stopped their work. Passengers waiting at the bottom of the stairs turned to watch. Emergency responders paused mid-step in their duties. Nora Callahan returned the salute with equal precision, water dripping from her hair, movements carrying 12 years of military training that had prepared her for moments exactly like this one. Nearby, the two Navy officers had reached the bottom of the stairs. They stood apart from the other passengers, both soaked and shivering, watching an exchange that reframed everything they thought they knew about competence and worth. One managed to catch her eye as she lowered her hand. His face flushed with shame. He gave a stiff, awkward nod that might have been an apology, if he'd been capable of speaking. The other simply looked away, studying his shoes as though they held answers he didn't want to face. But Nora didn't linger on them. Apologies and acknowledgments from people who had already revealed their character weren't necessary. Dignity had a way of restoring itself without requiring validation from those who had tried to strip it away. She shouldered her duffel bag, water streaming from its canvas sides, and began walking toward the terminal lights. Lights that promised warmth, dry clothes, and the kind of mundane comfort that felt miraculous after 90 minutes of wondering if she'd ever experience ordinary things again. Behind her, the aircraft sat quietly in the rain, emergency strobes still painting its wings. Tomorrow, investigators would examine every system, document every failure, write reports that would become case studies in aviation programs. But none of that analysis would capture what truly happened during those crucial minutes. The moment when theoretical knowledge met practical experience. When years of working with machines in impossible conditions translated into the ability to keep them alive when everything logical said they should fail. She had carried humiliation like a stone after being escorted from first class. listening while officers who had never turned a wrench mocked her worth. But that weight was gone now, dissolved somewhere over the Atlantic, between crisis and resolution. Because in the end, when metal screamed and electronics faltered, when 200 lives hung in the balance, there had been no question about who belonged in that cockpit. She had earned her place there the same way she had earned everything else, through a simple, relentless willingness to know her job completely, and to do it without needing recognition. Through rain and wind, the terminal building grew larger, a beacon of survival. Its windows glowed yellow with the promise of hot coffee and heated air and all the small comforts that made survival worth celebrating. But as she walked toward safety, Nora Callahan wasn't thinking about vindication or revenge, or any of the emotions people might expect from someone who'd been publicly dismissed and then privately proven essential. She was thinking about the sound the engines had made when they finally responded to her adjustments. The way hydraulics smoothed out when she rerouted pressure feeds. The moment when a dying machine decided to live a little longer because someone knew how to ask it the right way. That conversation between mechanic and machine, conducted in the language of metal stress, fluid pressure, and electrical current, that was where she belonged. Not in first class or economy class or any of the social categories people used to decide who mattered and who didn't. She belonged wherever broken things needed fixing and failing systems needed coaxing back to life. And sometimes, when the stakes were high enough and the need was great enough, that was exactly where people like Captain Damian Rourke looked for her. What would you have done if you'd seen someone treated like that during boarding? Would you have trusted Nora when the pilot called her to the cockpit? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspective matters here. If this story reminded you that real expertise doesn't always wear the uniform you expect, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Share this with someone who knows that the quietest person in the room might be exactly the person everyone needs most. More stories about hidden heroes are waiting on your screen right now. Click one and keep the momentum going, because I'll be back tomorrow with another reminder that courage doesn't always announce itself. Until then, remember, sometimes the person they try to put in the back is the only one who can bring everyone safely home.